In the quiet edges of Forsyth County, Georgia, a woman opened her home to her stepdaughter and her husband, a man freshly ordained, grieving his mother, and ready to start a new life. What followed in the months after would leave a neighborhood in disbelief, a congregation split down the middle, and a grave where no grave should have been. There were no sirens the night it happened. No screams. No reports of a struggle. Just one missing woman, a fractured marriage, and a church that suddenly stopped meeting. Investigators didn't know what they were looking for until a retired veteran came forward with something he saw weeks earlier. What started as a favor between family unraveled into one of the most disturbing timelines they'd ever documented. And at the center of it all was a video, a scandal, and silence that went on for far too long. Joseph Briggs was ordained in the spring of 2022, just weeks after burying his mother in Montgomery, Alabama. He had spent most of his life in the church, first as a drummer, then a youth leader, then eventually stepping in for sermons when needed. But it was his mother's passing, according to those around him, that pushed him into finally taking up the call full-time. By June, he and his wife, Alicia, were packing up their belongings to leave Montgomery behind. Their destination, Cumming, Georgia. They had no children, no savings to lean on, no congregation waiting. The decision, Joseph told friends, came through what he described as prayer and divine prompting, an urge to start fresh somewhere unfamiliar. But for Alicia, the move made logistical sense. Her stepmother, Valeria Johnson, lived alone just outside town and had a spare room. Temporary lodging, she said, until they could stand on their feet. By July, they arrived in Forsyth County with a borrowed sedan, less than $900 between them, and no formal job offers. Joseph found a low-cost way to begin. He rented a 25 by 40-foot tent from a local event supplier and set it up behind a small laundromat on Canton Road. He managed to gather folding chairs from a nearby thrift store, along with a modest podium that had been used in a school board meeting room. The rent for the narrow strip of land was $180 per week, paid in cash to a retired mechanic who owned the lot. Meanwhile, Valeria kept her home open without fuss. Her two-bedroom brick house off Tribble Gap Road was modest but well-kept. Joseph and Alicia took the guest room. They contributed when they could, though it was mostly small grocery runs and household chores. Valeria, divorced for years, had grown used to her routines and independence, but didn't resist her stepdaughter's request. Church or not, Alicia had always been the one member of her ex-husband's family she still spoke to. Those early months were quiet. Church on Sundays. Flyers midweek. Occasional prayer meetings under the tent on Thursdays. Joseph worked part-time at a car wash on Browns Bridge Road to support the church bills. Alicia began applying for jobs, mostly in retail and admin roles. From the outside, it looked like a young couple chasing a vision. No scandals. No complaints. Just a man, his wife, and a borrowed room in a house that would later become the center of a case no one in the community would forget. Jada Johnson, Valeria's only daughter from her first marriage, had a different energy. She visited twice a month, typically unannounced, and stayed for long weekends. Unlike her mother, Jada held strong opinions and voiced them freely. She hadn't hidden her resentment over her mother's past marriage ending. She never forgave her stepfather for leaving. And now, she was seeing the daughter of that man sleeping in her mother's guest room. The first confrontation came within an hour of Jada's arrival. Joseph was out, and Alicia had stepped into the kitchen to make tea. Jada made no effort to greet her. Instead, she asked Valeria, plainly and loudly, why strangers were living in her house. When Valeria reminded her that Alicia wasn't a stranger, Jada rolled her eyes. She's still his child, she said, referencing the ex-husband she blamed for breaking the home. You do realize that, right? Joseph became her next target, though they rarely interacted. Jada never acknowledged him by name. She referred to him as the preacher, and not in a respectful tone. She questioned the sudden decision to move to Georgia. She doubted his motives. She suggested, more than once, that religion was a convenient cover for men who didn't want real jobs. These comments weren't always made directly, but they were always made loud enough to be heard. Tension in the house thickened with each visit. Jada left no space for neutrality. She accused her mother of betraying blood ties for the sake of church people. Valeria tried to explain the temporary nature of the arrangement, but the explanation never landed. Jada believed the couple was manipulating her mother's kindness, and said as much. By late October, after multiple visits and failed attempts to convince her mother to evict Alicia and Joseph, Jada shifted strategy. According to statements later obtained during the investigation, she felt ignored, undermined, and increasingly agitated that her concerns had gone unheard. In her view, something needed to happen to force the situation to an end. She decided she'd make that happen herself. The following week, during a visit, Jada entered the house while Joseph was out delivering flyers. Alicia had taken a temp shift at a retail store nearby. With the house to herself, Jada positioned a compact camera, a home security device she claimed was for her mother's safety, in the living room, mounted low behind a bookshelf facing the couch. The lens was angled just enough to capture anyone seated there. A few minutes later, Joseph returned and found Jada seated alone in the living room. According to the timeline established later, he sat beside her briefly and started a casual conversation. Then, suddenly, she dragged him onto herself, so it looked like he was on her, and she was struggling to push him away. Before he could say or do anything, she stood and walked toward the hallway. Joseph appeared confused but made no move. Jada left shortly after. What followed was a careful edit of the footage she'd recorded. Investigators would later confirm that the original video was altered. The uncut version showed Jada initiating contact, leaning toward Joseph, then dragging him to come on top of her. There was no aggression. No inappropriate behavior from him. But the edited version removed the beginning and end, leaving only the middle portion, where it looked like Joseph initiated the act due to the video angle. That fragment, removed from context, appeared suggestive. Manipulated, but enough to plant doubt. Jada presented the footage to Valeria the next morning. She claimed he had forced himself on her, but she narrowly escaped the assault. Valeria reportedly watched it once and reacted immediately. She didn't question the context. She didn't ask for clarity. Instead, she became enraged. For her, the image of Joseph on her daughter with that expression was all she needed. The timing made it worse. Joseph had been staying in her house for months. The trust she had extended was instantly shattered. That Sunday, Valeria walked into the makeshift tent church incoming during the middle of service. Joseph was preaching. A small crowd of about 25 people was gathered, most of them familiar faces from the neighborhood. Valeria didn't wait. She stepped to the front row, raised her voice, and accused him publicly of misconduct toward her daughter. What followed was chaos. The service was paused. Joseph stood frozen. No fight broke out, but the mood turned. Some attendees walked out immediately, avoiding eye contact. Others waited outside, confused and uneasy. Within minutes, the service was effectively over. Attendance dropped sharply after that. The damage had been done. Joseph didn't respond publicly. Alicia didn't either. But the word had already started spreading, and for a church just trying to grow, it was a blow that many wouldn't recover from. The morning after the outburst at the tent church, the atmosphere inside Valeria Johnson's home shifted completely. According to phone records and neighbor statements gathered during the investigation, there were no physical altercations, only a string of tense conversations that ended with a demand. Alicia and Joseph needed to leave. Valeria made the decision final. She didn't want apologies, explanations, or defense. She repeated that her home was no longer open to people she couldn't trust. For Alicia, the moment was humiliating. Her stepmother had been the one person who welcomed her after her father remarried and started a new family elsewhere. Now that bridge was severed. Within 2 days, the couple had packed their bags and left. They had nowhere else to go in town. Joseph contacted the property owner of the lot where the church tent stood and asked if he could stay there temporarily. The man agreed under the condition that Joseph kept the area clean and paid his weekly rent without fail. The church tent space was never meant for living. It had no insulation, no plumbing, no kitchen. Joseph brought a mattress and kept it tucked behind the podium. At night, he used a camping lantern and ran a small extension cord from the nearby laundromat for charging his phone. Alicia stayed 2 nights, then left quietly. She boarded a bus back to Montgomery, Alabama, without telling many people. What convinced her, according to a statement later given to police, was the video. Though she hadn't seen the full version, what she was shown by Jada raised enough doubt. Combined with the public disgrace and her stepmother's certainty, Alicia couldn't find the strength to stay. She returned to her father's house, reactivating a phone number she had stopped using months earlier. She applied for part-time work and told relatives she needed space. When asked about Joseph, she said she didn't know where their marriage stood. She wasn't filing for divorce, not yet, but she didn't plan on going back either. In Georgia, Joseph continued hosting Sunday services. Attendance dropped from nearly 30 to under 10. No formal statement was made from Joseph's side. He continued preaching, continued handing out flyers. But his tone, according to those who remained, had changed, quieter, less energized, and more withdrawn. The church's Instagram page hadn't been updated since the incident. The online sermon recordings stopped. What had been a small but growing vision was now stalled. An uncertain future built under a rented tent, with a fractured marriage, and the weight of an accusation that had left more than just spiritual damage behind. On the night of November 19, 2022, Joseph Briggs left the church tent space just after 7:40 p.m. Surveillance footage from the adjacent laundromat captured him walking across the lot, wearing a black hoodie and jeans, carrying nothing visible in his hands. A timestamp from the camera aligns with the digital door log on the side entrance of Valeria Johnson's home. Her smart lock app recorded a manual unlock at 8:06 p.m. That night, according to available records, Valeria was home alone. Jada was not scheduled to visit that weekend, and Alicia was still in Alabama. Phone activity showed Valeria had been texting a friend earlier that evening about a baking recipe but stopped responding shortly after 8:10 p.m. No outgoing calls, no messages, and no activity from her bank accounts were recorded after that time. Neighbors later reported seeing a man fitting Joseph's description approach the house that evening. Inside, what happened remains a matter of confession and reconstruction. No surveillance footage captured the events within the home. No audio recordings exist. But what is known is that Valeria Johnson was never seen again after that night. She did not report to her part-time shift the next morning at the library. Her phone remained powered on for 2 more hours before going silent completely. At 10:23 p.m., the laundromat's camera once again recorded movement. Joseph reappeared on foot, entering the side of the church lot. This time, he was carrying what looked like a bundle of dark clothing. The footage was grainy, and no facial features could be confirmed, but investigators would later match the time of his return with a missing window in his phone activity, nearly 2.5 hours unaccounted for. He didn't call anyone that night. He didn't post on social media or send a message to Alicia. The tent space light stayed on until close to midnight. Then, according to the building's maintenance manager, all went dark. Over the next several days, Valeria's disappearance began to raise quiet concern. Her coworker texted twice with no reply. A neighbor noticed her garbage bin remained full. By the fourth day, a welfare check was requested. Officers arrived to find her car still parked in the driveway, her front door locked, and no signs of forced entry. The house was neat. But Valeria was gone. Joseph, when contacted by police during early questioning, claimed he had stopped by to apologize and clear the air. He said Valeria didn't let him in and that he left after a brief exchange at the door. There was no evidence to support or dispute that account, at least not yet. But the growing silence around Valeria's whereabouts would soon turn the attention back to the tent behind the laundromat, and to the man living inside it. On December 12, 2022, nearly 3 weeks after Valeria Johnson was last seen, a search warrant was executed at the church tent property behind the laundromat on Canton Road. The warrant followed multiple leads. Most notably, a tip from a neighbor who claimed to have seen unusual movement late at night in the vicinity of the tent on November 19th. That neighbor, Wendell Price, a 67-year-old retired Army veteran, had once attended Joseph Briggs's early church services. He told investigators he saw someone dragging a large, heavy object wrapped in what looked like a bedsheet toward the back corner of the property. At the time, he said, he assumed it was trash or equipment being moved. Authorities brought cadaver dogs to the site that morning. Within 45 minutes, handlers flagged an area of disturbed soil near the edge of the lot, just behind the makeshift platform used during Sunday services. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed irregularities beneath the surface. The digging began shortly after noon. By mid-afternoon, forensic teams had uncovered partial human remains. The condition of the body made immediate identification difficult, but the clothing matched the description given by Valeria's coworker of what she had worn the day she disappeared: a navy blue zip-up sweater and gray house shoes. An initial on-site assessment suggested signs of blunt trauma and asphyxiation, but the full autopsy would later confirm cause of death. The discovery was enough to trigger a rapid escalation in the investigation. Joseph Briggs was taken in for questioning later that evening. Alicia Briggs, still in Alabama, was also contacted. She agreed to speak with investigators remotely. Her responses were cooperative, but hesitant. She confirmed her husband had visited Valeria the night she vanished but claimed he told her nothing came of the visit. She added that she had been shown a video by Jada weeks earlier, which influenced her decision to leave. That video, until then treated as part of the background, was now re-examined. Investigators requested the original file from Jada Johnson. Under pressure and facing potential obstruction charges, she admitted that the footage she had shown was edited. She claimed it had been an emotional decision, not an attempt to frame Joseph Briggs for a crime. She said she never expected things to go this far. The full, unedited footage was retrieved from the camera's cloud backup. It revealed a very different scene than what had been shown to Valeria. Jada was the one who initiated contact. There was no aggression or misconduct in the original clip. With that revelation, the narrative around the earlier scandal began to shift. But for Valeria, the damage was irreversible. The body was officially identified 2 days later through dental records. A quiet vigil was held near the property line where the remains were found. The church tent was taken down the same week. Joseph Briggs was no longer just the man at the center of a scandal. He was now the primary suspect in a homicide investigation. And the lie that started it all had finally been exposed. Joseph Briggs was arrested on the evening of December 13, 2022, less than 24 hours after the discovery of human remains behind the tented church space. His arrest took place without incident at a nearby gas station, where he was seen refilling a thermos of coffee. Officers approached quietly, informed him of the warrant, and took him into custody. He did not resist. At the station, Briggs initially maintained his innocence, repeating his earlier claim that Valeria Johnson had refused to let him into her home the night she disappeared. But with the forensic evidence mounting, and with the video at the center of the original scandal now proven manipulated, his story began to unravel. Over the course of 2 separate interviews, spaced across 2 days, Joseph changed course. On December 15th, in the presence of his court-appointed attorney, he gave a full confession. According to the recorded statement, Joseph admitted that he had gone to Valeria's house that night intending to make peace. He described being overwhelmed by the fallout, the public shaming, the church collapse, and the sudden departure of his wife. He said he felt stripped of everything. Joseph claimed that when Valeria opened the door, she told him she had nothing more to say. He insisted on talking. The conversation escalated quickly. He said she accused him again, stood by the edited video, and told him she regretted ever letting him into her home. He described something snapping. In his words, "I wanted to make the accusation real. The shame was too much." He confessed to forcefully sleeping with Valeria for over 15 minutes while she struggled to leave, then strangling her when she tried to escape. Afterward, he said he sat on the floor next to her body for nearly 2 hours, in shock. When it grew dark, he wrapped her in an old curtain from the guest room, placed her in the back seat of his car, and drove her to the church lot. He chose the burial spot behind the platform, digging through the night with a borrowed shovel he had used for setting up tent stakes months earlier. He returned home at dawn and resumed his routine as if nothing had happened. Investigators made sure he said everything he had to say. What made the case especially difficult for the community was the collapse of so many relationships at once, between Joseph and his wife, between Jada and her mother, and between the church and its followers. What began as a misunderstanding fueled by resentment had ended with a death and a confession that would shape the final outcome of the investigation. The trial of Joseph Briggs began in late May 2023 at the Forsyth County Superior Court. Alicia Briggs did not attend in person. Jada Johnson, though not charged, was issued a subpoena and later appeared in person. Prosecutors presented the case in sequence, relying heavily on 3 core pillars: the manipulated surveillance footage, the eyewitness testimony from Wendell Price, and Joseph Briggs's recorded confession. The original video, played frame by frame in court, clearly showed Jada initiating contact in the living room, without any physical misconduct from Joseph. A digital forensic expert testified that the file Jada had shared with her mother had been deliberately edited to remove key context. Wendell Price's testimony was methodical. The retired Army veteran described what he saw the night of November 19th, a figure resembling Joseph dragging a large object across the church property under the cover of darkness. He said the man moved with intent but didn't appear frantic. His calm recollection strengthened the prosecution's timeline. The most damning moment came when the prosecution played Joseph's full confession to the jury. In it, he admitted to the assault and strangulation of Valeria Johnson, describing it as an act driven by rage and desperation. He detailed how he buried her body using tools he had previously kept for tent maintenance. The medical examiner later confirmed the cause of death as manual strangulation, with signs of head trauma consistent with the defendant's description. Joseph's defense team did not contest the authenticity of the confession but instead focused on his mental state at the time. They argued diminished responsibility, citing emotional breakdown following the false accusation, public humiliation, and abandonment by his wife. A clinical psychologist was brought in by the defense to testify that Joseph displayed signs of acute stress disorder, though the prosecution countered that emotional distress did not excuse deliberate homicide and concealment. Jada Johnson, while not on trial, faced intense scrutiny during proceedings. Her actions were dissected in court, particularly the decision to manipulate the video. Prosecutors made it clear that while her behavior set off a tragic chain of events, Georgia law at the time made it difficult to pursue criminal charges due to the lack of direct incitement to violence or false report to authorities. She left court without an indictment. After 6 days of arguments and a full day of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all major counts, including second-degree murder, aggravated assault, and unlawful concealment of a body. The judge revoked bail immediately and scheduled sentencing for the following month. In the eyes of the court, justice had been served, but not without collateral damage that would leave lasting scars across both families. Joseph Briggs was sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole on July 10, 2023. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial. Only a few members of the public remained. No press were allowed during the sentencing. In the months that followed, his name faded from headlines, but the consequences of his actions, and the events that led up to them, remained deeply embedded in the local community. Alicia Briggs visited the correctional facility once, shortly after the sentencing. According to prison visitor logs, the meeting lasted just under an hour. No public record exists of what was discussed, but court filings confirmed that within 10 days of that visit, Alicia filed for divorce in Montgomery County. The paperwork cited irreconcilable differences and made no mention of the criminal case. The divorce was finalized in mid-September. 2 months later, she remarried. The identity of her new spouse was not disclosed, and she reportedly relocated out of state. Back in Forsyth County, the tent church no longer stood. By August, the landowner had dismantled the structure and cleared the lot. The folding chairs, podium, and speaker system were sold off or discarded. What remained was a patch of worn grass and a faint outline in the dirt where services had once taken place. The space was eventually repurposed as a parking extension for the laundromat. Valeria Johnson's funeral was held quietly in the first week of July. Only immediate family attended. No programs were printed, and no church was named. She was buried in a small cemetery just outside of Cumming, in a plot she had pre-selected years earlier. Her daughter, Jada, did not speak at the service. No formal charges were filed against her, but public opinion remained harsh. She deleted her social media accounts and was reported to have left Georgia shortly after the trial concluded. The case left no real victories. A woman was dead. A man was imprisoned. A family had imploded over a lie that never should have gained traction. Investigators who worked the case described it as one of the most tragic and avoidable outcomes they'd seen in recent years, not because of a single act of violence, but because of how many small acts of pride, manipulation, and silence built up over time. In the end, justice was served. But there were no celebrations, no public relief. Just a fractured set of lives, each carrying pieces of a truth that, once revealed, left nothing whole.